Henry Kissinger is 92 years old and continues to work at his international consulting firm in New York City. His advice is still sought by U.S. presidents and world leaders. Kissinger immigrated to the United States in 1938 from Germany, served in the U.S. Army in World War II, and was a member of the faculty at Harvard University. He served as U.S. National Security Advisor and U.S. Secretary of State for the Nixon and Ford administrations. In 1971, Kissinger made two secret trips to China, paving the way for the historic trip to Beijing by President Richard Nixon in 1972. He was also awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 1973 for negotiations to end the Vietnam War. Over the years, Henry Kissinger has traveled to China more than 50 times and is the author of numerous books, including On China. This week, I had the chance to sit down with Dr. Kissinger at his New York office. Dr. Kissinger, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure to be here.
Later this month, the Chinese President Xi Jinping will be coming to the United States. It will be his first official visit to this country. Already U.S. officials are saying that they hope this will be a milestone in the relationship between these two countries. How do you see this visit?
The visit of President Xi can be of great importance. And I agree with the word milestone, because we are in a situation now where originally the relation between the United States and China concerned a common adversary. Now we are in a situation where the world economy and world peace depends on our cooperation. And so it is very important that the Chinese president and the American president meet periodically to exchange ideas and to achieve parallel policies when that is at all possible.
Given those problems that you mentioned, we have sectarian differences in the world right now. We have wars, we have religious upheavals, we have terrorism. Does the United States and China need each other more now?
Yes, we are at a moment when there's worldwide violence and there are upheavals in many parts of the world, and the economies of various parts of the world are closely related. But the joint economy of China and the United States probably represent close to half of the entire world economy. So we need each other, and we need to develop concepts and policies by which we can proceed on parallel roads.
You have been a student of U.S.-China relations for decades. You've written widely about this relationship. You have witnessed how these two countries have changed, how the relationship has evolved over the years. How would you characterize or describe the current relationship between the U.S. and China?
Well, there have been many periods in this relationship, but I would describe the current relationship as broader-based and more intense in terms of the actual consultations that are going on than at any previous period. And even in the previous periods, there was constant progress. But I would say at this moment, we are interacting more than we have ever before. And some of it is new, so some of it leads to public disagreements. But one should look not at the day-to-day statements, but at the long-term trend. And the long-term trend, I think, is positive.
One of those public disagreements has been over Chinese territorial claims in the South China Sea. Do you think that is an issue that's going to be addressed when President Xi comes to Washington? And is there a diplomatic solution to it?
Well, I don't think in the limited time available for a state visit that you can solve a problem that has centuries long origin. But you can have a discussion of the road in which the solutions should be found. And I believe one could separate the various issues, such as freedom of navigation, sovereignty, and deal with them autonomously. And the first decision has to be, and I think is, that this is not a subject on which countries will go to war with each other. So a negotiation has to be successful, and I believe if we proceed on a case-by-case basis, the situation will greatly improve.
President Xi will also be addressing the 70th General Assembly at the United Nations. What do you expect to come out of that speech?
The General Assembly is, I can tell you from personal experience, is a tough audience to address because these are professional diplomats and they're sitting there and the speaker has spent a lot of time preparing his remarks and the audience is usually totally impassive, so that the television pictures don't always bear a relationship to the substance. But I would think that President Xi will give to the UN a statement of Chinese views of the evolution of the international system. And I would not be surprised if he talked about some of his version of the Chinese dream, some of these ideas of how nations that in the past have been adversaries can work together for common objectives. That has been the theme of his speeches. And I would think that at the UN, it will be a statement of China's overall approach to international relations.
Another development that's making news in China, the Chinese will be commemorating the end of World War II, the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, with a major parade in Beijing. It will give China a chance to show off some of its military hardware. What do you think is the significance of this?
Well, it sort of marks a culmination of a phase of history. That China, which had been occupied and subject to intrusions from foreign countries, has now reconstituted itself and goes back to its historic position as one of the leading powers. And so I think it is a tribute, in a way, to China's past, and it's an indication of Chinese strength. But I am assuming that our relationship will not be based on showing each other our military potential, but finding a way to solve common problems.
Do you think there has been sufficient recognition in the rest of the world on the role that China played in ending World War II?
Well, the world, of course, is a big place. And it depends in which part of the world.
I talk particularly of the United States and Europe.
Well, the United States public is unfortunately not always fully familiar with either the history or geography of other regions of the world. But being myself a veteran of the Second World War, having served in the U.S. Army, I think that for that generation, the Chinese suffering and the Chinese endurance in that war have been an extremely impressive experience in their life. For the modern generation that's brought up on the internet and that responds more to stimuli, knowledge of history is not what it should be by my standards. And I deplore in my own grandchildren their lack of knowledge of American history, much less of Chinese history.
Well, you went to China in the early 70s. You're widely credited with opening up this relationship between the United States and China. Did you ever consider at that time when you went in the 70s that one day this would be an economic powerhouse, the powerhouse that it is today?
Now, if somebody had told me in 1971, if somebody had made a sketch and said this is what Beijing will look like and China will look like 25 years from now, I would have thought he was out of his mind, because at that time there were no automobiles in the street, there were no consumer goods, everyone was dressed the same, there were no skyscrapers. So if the citizens of today were transported back to 71, they would think they're living in a physically different country. It's an astonishing achievement. And what is most astonishing about it is that it was really essentially done by the Chinese people without any governmental help from any other country. So that is for somebody who had lived through it, that is a enormous experience.
China restructured its economic model and it now has a huge impact around the world.
Right.
How big do you consider that impact?
Well, it is inevitable. I mean, first of all, China is now a significant percentage of the world economy. And Chinese savings and Chinese exports have a daily impact on the world. So we are now in a new situation. When I went to China in the 1970s, American trade with China was less than with Honduras. And now it is in a quantity that affects the whole world. So what is now a permanent feature, and what we should learn again in the new recent crisis, is that neither country can benefit at the expense of the other. Because if one country's economy gets damaged, not only the two countries get damaged, but the whole world economy gets damaged. So there is now a need for a degree of interaction that was absolutely inconceivable in the first decade of my experience with China. There was really very little trade.
And now we see some of the impact that China has. There is a slowing down of the Chinese economy right now, and we see that it's hurting markets throughout the world. What do you make of that slowdown right now?
Well, as I understand it, the Chinese economy is transiting from an export-led model to one that puts somewhat more reliance on consumer spending. And it is also reorienting its foreign policy in some of these concepts, like the Silk Road concept. When you have a transition from one model to another, it's inevitable that you cannot do it in perfect synchronization. And I take that to be a natural evolution of the Chinese policy. And I think in the future, if you look at the evolution of Western economies, they too have had periodic crises, maybe more acute than the Chinese one has now. But having seen how China has evolved over the last 30 years, I look at this as a temporary, almost inevitable aspect of transition from which we should, both sides, learn that we should synchronize our economic policies in order to have a minimum impact on each other.
So in the years ahead, we would see far more growth in this relationship between the United States and China.
Yes, there are really two aspects to it. Some of it is absolutely inevitable. it's the nature of modern economy and the nature of the modern politics of the internet and of all these communications. The second is acts of deliberate policy by the two countries. And I have the impression from the statements of President Xi and President Obama that they both recognize the essential importance of a deepening of the dialogue and that they are looking for ways to accomplish this.
We are, of course, in election season right now in the United States. There will be a presidential election next year. We're already hearing some anti-Chinese rhetoric coming from Republican candidates in this election. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, there have even been suggestions that President Obama should cancel the visit of President Xi.
Well, I've read some of these comments. Of course, I generally support the Republican Party, but I don't agree with the statements of some of the candidates. But I try to look at it in some perspective. There have been, I think, 6 or 7 elections since the opening to China. And it occasionally happens in these elections that anti-Chinese statements are made. But the significant thing to remember is that there has really been the most continuous foreign policy of America has been the relationship with China. Every new president, no matter what he said in the campaign, has been brought by reality to the recognition that you have, that this relationship is an integral part of the international system. And I believe that this will, I'm confident that this will happen again. And I would just urge you listeners or viewers to not take every word that is said in the campaign as a final statement.
I'd like to get your view on another important issue that's been preoccupying the United States, and that is the nuclear deal with Iran. The United States, together with other world powers, have reached this deal with Iran. It's become a major political issue here in the United States. What is your view on that deal?
I have written on this subject. I think this agreement will be approved, and therefore the public discussion now should not be into the details of the agreement, but into the consequences. And one should, and I think both China and the United States have an interest that nuclear weapons not spread through the Middle East, and that these groups that represent an extreme form of jihadism not become the dominant groups in the region. And now the test will be whether Iran will be prepared to draw the political consequences from an essentially military agreement, and to see whether that starts a new era or whether the existing conflicts will continue.
President Obama has called this the most significant non-proliferation agreement in history. Do you agree?
We'll see. It's a very complicated agreement, and I have expressed my uneasiness that Iran has been recognized as a major producer of nuclear technology and thereby of nuclear weapons. And if all the provisions of the agreement are carefully carried out, and if Iran and the United States draw the political consequences from this agreement, then we can make a judgment of what it contributed.
One final question, Dr. Kissinger. In terms of your own legacy, how would you like to be remembered?
You know, I'm often asked this question. But when you are living through a period that has such turbulent change, you can't write your own history. I never thought that I would be identified with close relations with China. And it has evolved. It was planned, but in terms of my life, it was unexpected. And it's become a very big feature of my life now. So I'm now of an age where I can say most of what I'm going to achieve I've done. And so I would have to let others decide what my legacy is. But the relation with China is surely one of the things I'm most proud of.
Dr. Kissinger, thank you very much for your time.